Hello, this is another delve into the realm of narrative and the power of narrative as a concept, as an idea. And again, we've done several podcasts around the idea of epistemology within polytheism. This is not about epistemology, rather it's, well, I suppose kind of a little bit anyway, but not mainly about epistemology. It's taking a look into the power of narrative as a philosophical concept within the realm of polytheism, but also taking in a few other realms and a way to help kind of contextualize and explain the concepts in general. And for anyone unfamiliar, there are quite a number of philosophers and psychologists and sociologists and ethicists and a range of other people who've looked at this idea of narrative and the notion that humans are a peculiarly narrative species. We love to tell each other stories and to tell ourselves stories. So even when we're alone, we are telling ourselves a story quite frequently. Or sitting quietly reading a book with a story in it, or watching the telly, or listening to the radio, or whatever it is that we might be doing, and exploring and engaging in the realm of stories because we just love stories so much. Now, for those psychologists who have looked at narrative and the idea that each of us has a life narrative, a story of our lives, a story of the people we are, and sociologists take that at a more collective level to say that there are stories of community groups, the stories of what it means to be British, the stories of what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be, let's say, a member of the Labour Party or the SNP or whatever. All of these different kind of community groups around which people coalesce have their narratives and their stories that bind them together. We have a notion stemming from the academic study of history that within history, a historical account of something should be factually correct. It should have all of the salient relevant facts and put them in the right order and double check that they're all true. And so when you read the history of something, what you are reading is true. That is not necessarily the case with narrative. In fact, it's very rarely the case with narrative. Because within the realm of narrative, what is important is not, did this really happen? Rather, does this make emotional sense? Is this viscerally appealing? Does it create identity? Does it help people bond together? Does it inspire people? And there can certainly be times when, shall we say, creative narratives and supposedly factual histories are presented as if they were one and the same thing, and people get confused as to which is which, and that can lead to all sorts of problems and difficulties and yeah, complexities that are perhaps best avoided. We are both individuals and collective beings. We exist at both levels simultaneously. I exist as an individual person in my own right, at least I like to fantasize that I do, but I'm also a member of various different groups, and some of those groups may be terribly important to me, religious identity groups, for example, and other groups may not be particularly important to me, but possibly might be very important to other people who look on and perceive some aspect of my collective identity as very important to them. So skin colour is not particularly important to me, but it might well be to somebody else who might see me as part of a bigger group. Now, whether they see that group in a very positive sense or whether they see it in a very negative sense will obviously be down to their individual experiences, but also their individual narratives, which is an interesting area in and of itself, that often people can come to greatly like a group or greatly dislike a group, not because they have very positive direct personal experiences or very negative direct personal experiences, but because they are aware of very positive stories or very negative stories. So even though maybe they have very little direct experience of that group, or the experience they have is very mixed, very ambiguous, a bit of good, a bit of bad, a bit of this, a bit of that, nonetheless the narratives in their head are predominantly either very positive or very negative, and so they see the group not through the light of direct experience, but through the light of narrative. And that can operate in a whole variety of different forms and different manners. We don't live by just one narrative. We acquire narratives as we go. So we have our own private narrative, the story of me, of how I came to be the person I am today, and what events have happened to me, and which ones of those events are terribly important, and which of those events are so trivial they're not worth remembering in the first place. Were those events good? Were they bad? Am I an admirable person, or am I a terrible person? Am I a deep person, a shallow person, this, that, the other? All of these different narratives about the kind of person I am. Then we have the narratives of family, or of where my family has come from and what we've done in the world, and where the various different branches of my family now reside, and the sorts of people they are, the sorts of jobs they do, all of those kinds of things. And we can kind of build up from there. So there is the narrative of the town in which I live, its history, its backstory, the kinds of people who live here, the narrative of the county, the narrative of the country, the bigger and bigger narratives, but also, as well as bigger and bigger narratives, there are other narratives that subdivide. So a narrative of my religious community. I don't have a particular political community that I belong to, a particular political outlook, but if I did, then there would be the narrative of that. I'm a Doctor Who fan, so there is the narrative of that outright work of fiction, but as well as being an outright work of fiction, there's also the sort of factual elements within the fiction, the names of actors, of directors, of writers, of the years in which things were first broadcast, and all that sort of thing, the sort of backstage story as well as the on-screen story. So we have all of these relatively small narratives that, whereas there are, 64 million people in Britain, which is a big scale narrative for the whole country, we have narratives that only affect a small fraction of that overall population. So some narratives connect us to the big picture, other narratives connect us to the small picture, and we need both. And we mix and we flow between these different narratives. Some of them we may understand very well, some of them we may only have the most cursory grasp of. Different narratives serve different functions within our lives. So to give you a few examples of narratives that perhaps play huge importance to some people, not to everyone by any stretch of the imagination, but to some people, you could argue, and certainly a fair number of psychologists have argued, that conspiracy theories are a form of narrative. Particularly seeing a lot of those online at the moment when I go onto social media. Conspiracy theories around COVID and around vaccinations, one thing and another. Why do people come up with conspiracy theories, and why do others who hear them then believe them and embrace them? It's not necessarily because there's any great deal of evidence for these things, because frequently there isn't. But again, it's the idea that narrative is not a factual accounting of the world rather. Narrative is emotional, it's visceral, it's bonding, it's giving meaning and sense, and something can make a form of sense without needing any great deal of fact or detail or grounding in a daily lived experience for it to nonetheless make a form of intuitive sense. And so we can say that there isn't a singular conspiracy theory with a singular narrative. There's lots of theories and therefore lots of narratives. And perhaps people are drawn to these because they help to make sense of their life experience. They help contextualize things, they place them in a wider context. And so they're tremendously appealing, even if other people look on and say, well, where's your evidence for this claim? Where's your evidence for that claim? It is not about evidence, and it's a mistake to think it is about evidence necessarily. Within the realm of politics, there are all sorts of subsets and narratives. So the Conservative Party has a narrative, the Lib Dems have a narrative, Labour have a narrative, Plaid Cymru have a narrative. All of the various political parties have their narratives and stories of where they've come from. But the important point to bear in mind about these sorts of narratives, possibly really to some extent, maybe about most sorts of narratives, but certainly within the political sphere, and likewise with the conspiracy theorists, is that the narrative doesn't just explain where this political party originated from, where this conspiracy theory originated from. It contextualizes the whole world. What is the best approach to the world? What is the best way to understand the world? And so that fits within a much bigger, grand narrative, as well as the history of the Labour Party, the history of Plaid Cymru. You've got a much bigger picture of understanding where politics sits into the grand scheme of things, where you, if you vote for that party, sit in the grand scheme of things. And of course, some of these narratives, some of them, probably all of them to an extent, not only are a self-accounting, they're also an accounting for other people. So the Conservative Party not only has a narrative about itself, it has a narrative about the Labour Party, and vice versa. So this is why we vote this way, and this is why them lot vote that way. Now, whether them lot would agree with that description is well, beside the point, really, because it's not a narrative for them, it's a narrative about them. And it's a way of placing other people's motives, other people's thinking, other people's behaviour into an intelligible context. So either they are well-meaning but misguided, or they're wicked and corrupt, or they're avaricious and stupid, they're this, they're that, they're the other. It places them in some sort of context, some sort of understanding. And we can say the same within religions. So there is a narrative of Christianity, that obviously the story of the formation of Christianity and the formation of the various different churches and denominations and what have you, but also a narrative about people who don't believe, about non-Christians, about atheists and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and so on, about where the rest of the world fits into the Christian story, which again is not necessarily an account that those people would agree with, but it's not for them, it's about them. And that is, in many ways, the nature of many narratives. So you could say family narratives are often not only about where our family come from, our history, where we've moved to, what we've done, what we've achieved, who married who had how many children, and all the rest of it. But it's also a way of accounting for interactions with other families, the communities we've moved into, what were other people like when we arrived in that town, or we emigrated to that country, or we did this, or we did that. Did they like us? Did they hate us? Were they kind? Were they rude? Were they friendly? Were they hostile? Were they indifferent? It's a way of accounting for other people in the same sort of context, the same sort of way. And coming back to the political idea, then you've got not only parties and partisan politics, but more broad movements that are not parties per se, but they're broad movements, communism and capitalism, for example. So there is a narrative of communism and a narrative of capitalism, and they each have a narrative about one another. And whichever, if you subscribe to either of them at all, of course, whichever one you subscribe to, it contextualizes your world, it gives you a sense of purpose, of belonging, of understanding how human dynamics operate. We could say the same for example, feminism as a movement, a social movement of placing the world in context. And one element of interest to flag up within Christianity, obviously you have the forces of good and evil. You have God, Christ, and then you have Satan, the various minions of hell. So there is a narrative of rivalry between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between the forces that are us on our side and the forces of them lot over there that are against us and opposed to us. And that tension between hostile forces, rival forces, you can say perhaps crops up in a lot of different types of stories, not just Christian one, but in a plethora of stories. So conspiracy theories, by their very nature, assume that there is a malevolent presence. I've yet to hear of a conspiracy that was about people conspiring to be lovely, conspiring to be kind. It's usually that they're conspiring in some horrible, sinister, malicious sort of a way to do some vile thing to the world at large. And so there is us, the enlightened, those who know about the conspiracy, and then there is the evil people carrying out the conspiracy, the good is, the bad is. Attention. The way political parties view one another, often it's in the sense of us lot, we're the goodies, them lot over there, they are at best dozy and misguided, at worst outright malicious, evil, malevolent forces that have to be opposed. the way communism and capitalism tend to view each other is very much in a hostile rivalry context, with each side convinced that they're the goodies and that the other people are the baddies. You could argue certainly radical feminism in the 70s was very much about the malign forces of patriarchy. So rather than the devil, you have the patriarchy as this malicious presence that hovers over society, against which feminists fight and oppose themselves and try and dismantle the patriarchy. And even those who would not necessarily class themselves as radical feminists, maybe more moderate feminists, might well still subscribe to that notion of this malignant political force that has to be opposed. And so you do get a lot of narratives that are setting up competition, setting up conflict, setting up warfare between different forces, different social classes, different genders, different racial groups, different religious convictions, in all sorts of contexts where there can be understood to be malignant forces that rope people in to serve their ways, and which those in the know, those who are wise to what's going on, have to kind of fight against, and sometimes maybe succeed in converting people to see the light, but often there's a strong hostile context there. And we can see to a degree some of that going on in mythology. So if we look to Greek mythology, we have the Olympians and we have the Titans, and the Titanomachy, the war between the gods and the Titans going on. And so there are both the Titans in and of themselves, who are malevolent, dangerous, deadly forces, but there are also mortals who serve the Titans, people in the thrall. So just like the Omen, or one of these modern day horror stories, where you've got Satan himself and then you've got the minions of Satan doing his wicked deeds on earth. So you've got that element of deadly, dangerous, monstrous forces, immortal forces, but also their servants, their other human mortal servants. And the forces of good likewise have their mortal servants. We could look to Norse myth and the fire giants and the ice giants as these great hostile forces opposed to the gods. There's less a sense of mortals carrying out the plans on behalf of frost giants and fire giants. So not quite, doesn't pan out in quite the same way, but again, there is that element of tension and hostility in Hinduism, the conflict between the Devas and the Asuras, the gods and the sort of demonic forces of the world. And it may well be, with my own background and interest in Druidry, we sort of have an element of that with the Vamori, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods, and the Vamori, these malicious beasts that exist in the ocean, and like some kind of Lovecraftian horror film, slobbering out of the ocean, tentacles flailing to cause misery and mayhem. But that tends to be an understanding of the past, rather than the notion that the Vamori are currently in the 21st century working their wicked way upon the world and have mortal servants. So it's not quite panning out in the line of The Omen or one of those styles of horror books or horror films. But there's elements of it. And perhaps if we were able to travel back in time and get a much clearer account of how the Druids and the people taught by the Druids thought 2,000 odd years ago, maybe we would have had a much more clear-cut understanding of the dynamic perception as to what people saw going on at that juncture. One of the ideas I want to pick up on briefly comes from the French philosopher Baudrillard. Baudrillard had hundreds and hundreds of ideas, some of which don't make an awful lot of sense unless you are exceedingly French, and other ideas, at least some of his ideas that I want to explain here, have quite a lot going for them. One of the ideas that has quite a lot going for it is his notion that we are, particularly in the 20th century and 21st century, earlier than that it doesn't wholly apply really, because what he's focusing on to a large extent is the impact of cinema and the impact of television with these ideas. So Pre-cinema, pre-television, the ideas don't pan out in society as such in quite the same way. But he says we live so much of our life through the screen, through the silver screen of the cinema or of the TV set, or these days if you're watching on your tablet or whatever device you watch things on. That these, what he refers to as simulacra, these kind of artificial realities, these created realities, have a life of their own. And even when we turn the box off or leave the cinema and go out into the streets, we carry those images and those stories and those ideas in our minds, and that tends to affect how we interact with the world and what we expect of the world, and how we live our ordinary everyday lives. So in a sense, he says, there kind of isn't a reality anymore. Pre-cinema, pre-TV, there was a reality, but we've become so immersed in the artificial world of performance that we can't get our heads out of it. And so we engage in what should be daily real life with these films and TV shows and what have you, playing in our minds. So, for example, someone who watches romance films, Hollywood romance films, gets an idea of what a romantic relationship should be like. How should men and women treat each other, or two men, two women, depending on the film. How does romance work? And they'll start to expect their real life relationships to go the same way as cinematic relationships go, to be as romantic and as dramatic and as free of the boring bits, if we can put it like that. Hollywood films, or well, not just Hollywood, but any film producer, Bollywood, Nollywood, Ealing Studios, anybody else you care to imagine who's churning out films, they show you the grand romance and the fights and the making up and all the sort of dramatic bit. They don't tend to show the snoring like a warthog in bed, or farting, or scratching your nether regions, and all of the kind of day-to-day things of what it's like to live with another human being, and that you have to sort of get used to. So you get the, what should we say, sanitised version of romance, with the boring bits picked out of it. Just as like a murder mystery, an Agatha Christie type thing, you have the body and a discreet little bit of blood, but you don't get the stink of a rotting corpse, you don't get the visceral reality or the screaming grief of the bereaved relatives. It's sanitised and it's distanced. Baudrillard's argument is that we start to expect reality to emulate fiction. We start to expect it to pan out in that kind of a way. And of course it never does, because reality just isn't like fiction, it isn't in that way. And so we tend to live in a state of disappointment that our real life relationships never go the way that Hollywood romances go. And that things are not in reality as they seem to be on the screen. We could argue, as a number of historians have actually, that for an increasing number of people, going back to what we were saying earlier about history, and the idea of history as a series of facts and arranged in correct order and so forth. An increasing number of people, their idea of history is more influenced by the cinema than it is by academic textbooks. And of course, the Hollywood take on history is only vaguely related to things that have actually happened in the real world. It's a very sanitised, very pro-American, very managed perception of history. So if you've never read an actual history book and everything you think you know about history has come to you through a film or a TV show, you're likely to have a very odd idea of what's actually gone on in the world, of how history operates. And we might well say the further back we go in terms of cinematic history, the films put out in the, say, 1950s were even less accurate than the films tend to be in the 2000s, although they're pretty inaccurate too. The the warping of history becomes more pronounced the further back you go, quite frequently. So depending on quite when someone's cinematic viewing has started, or how broadly they view, do they only watch things made in their own lifetime, or do they watch more classic films and that sort of thing, that's going to shape their understanding of what history is actually like. And that history may well be elements of history that directly impact upon them. So a British person watching films about British history, a French person watching films about French history, or going beyond sort of national barriers, you could say a Jewish person watching films that touch on elements of Jewish history, or a Buddhist person watching films that touch on elements of Buddhist history. So whether it's your religious identity, your ethnic identity, your national identity, some other aspect of your identity again, your understanding of what it was like, what the history of your people is, if it has come to you via what is fundamentally a work of fiction, but you are treating it as history in the sense of being factual, you're going to be in for a bit of a shock. And you're going to end up not just with a weird view of history, but a weird view of yourself. Because you're believing things about your collective past that never happened. Or at least didn't happen in the way that some film has told you they've happened. And so that might start to quite significantly change your understanding of yourself and cause rifts with other people within your community who haven't seen those films, or whose understanding of history is much more textually based rather than cinematically based. And so it leads to internal conflicts within groups and all sorts of things like that. From a pagan stance, there have been waves which those of a certain age have probably been around long enough to notice some of the waves, in which cinema and TV have had a noticeable impact on people expressing an interest in paganism. So things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which featured a lot of magic and a character who described herself as Wiccan and had Wiccan friends and so on in the series. Harry Potter, both the books and the films, which is hardly anything to do with paganism at all, but puts a big emphasis on magic and witchcraft and wizardry and so on, has inspired some people to want to then look into paganism, which they're going to be, and will have been in for quite a probably a disappointment when they realise that what goes on in pagan communities is hardly anything to do with what goes on in Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Harry Potter or any of these other cinematic phenomena that inspire people. So there is an element in which you can have that kind of an impact. But also, again, people with an interest in, say, ancient Greek history, ancient Roman history, ancient Germanic history, are maybe more inspired by what they see in TV shows like The Vikings or Clash of the Titans, or other films about ancient Greek myth. And they're drawing more on the cinematic interpretation of ancient cultures and ancient mythologies than they are upon a more academic attempt to understand those cultures, because the cinematic, it's visual, it's dramatic, it's geared to be emotionally appealing. Academics rarely write history books to be emotionally engaging. Perhaps they should do, there might sell more of them. And be better understood, perhaps. They tend to write in a rather dry fashion, which is a shortcoming of academic writing styles. But it's often in a language that's quite alienating to the casual reader. And so they're hard to get into, and so other forms of supposed history are much more engaging and much more immediate, and much more enjoyable, I suppose, in many sorts of ways. And so it starts to shape and it starts to form people's understanding of their own cultures, or at least the cultures that they are for a while interested in. And that has a bit of an impact. Coming back to the idea of religious narratives and central narratives, each religion could be said to have its own dominant narratives. There are lots of sub-narratives, lots of small stories here, there and everywhere, stories about saints and priests and nuns and monks and this and that and the other. But often these are, shall we say, more peripheral stories around the edge, but with big major dominant stories in the centre. Christianity is a very obvious example of this, and one hopefully most of you will be familiar with. So obviously you've got the story of Christ as the central story, the story of his mission, of his betrayal, of his death on the cross and his resurrection. That is the dominant story within Christianity. And so all of the smaller stories about saints and the formation of churches and denominations and schisms and this and that, those are the peripheral stories around the edge of that central dominant story. And it shapes the lives of Christians. And it shapes the lives of many other people as well who aren't Christians, but who live in cultures which either currently are, or at least up until recently were, predominantly Christian. So you get the Easter holidays and the Christmas holidays and the rest of it. Whether or not you're Christian at all, that's the structure of the society that we in Britain live in, and many, many other parts of the world live within. It shapes the culture, it shapes the stories, it shapes the understanding. And I've known quite a lot of Christians who will draw upon imagery from the narrative, that central narrative, to clarify their own life. So if they are feeling particularly betrayed or let down by someone who was close to them, they might refer to that person overtly, or perhaps just unconsciously think of them as a Judas, and that act of betrayal as the act of Judas. If they're going through some temptation where they really want to do something which deep down they know is a bit shoddy and nasty, but it's really tempting and they really want to do it, and they're having that kind of game of a tug of war for their moral choices, then they quite often talk about this being their moment in the desert, 40 days and 40 nights, with the devil trying to tempt Christ with all of worldly wealth and power and glamour, and that they feel that not that they are being offered the glamour of the world, which is something much more small scale and what have you, but whatever it is that they're being tempted by then fits into the narrative of what Christ went through. And so all sorts of events in their life can be associated with events within the story and contextualized and understood, so that that story becomes a blueprint for the experiences of their own individual life. And that's the power of a truly great narrative. Now, previous podcasts, I've done some of them quite a while ago now, admittedly, but we've looked at Eric Burns, the Canadian psychologist's ideas around life scripts, in which he used Greek mythology, 6 myths from ancient Greece, to suggest that there were these templates, these life scripts that people lived their lives by, which were particularly destructive and particularly negative, and which they needed to get their heads out of by becoming consciously aware that their life was following these patterns. Now, his idea was not that everyone reads lots and lots of Greek myths and it has this huge impact on them. Rather, he was using the Greek myth in a somewhat poetic way to say that where these stories, where do they originate? And he said they originate from the family. Your mother's experiences, your father's experiences, your grandparents' experiences, the kinds of things spoken around the dinner table year in, year out, seep into the minds of the younger generation, and so they absorb the narrative of the family, and it only tangentially compares to a narrative within Greek myth. Whereas the Christian story, obviously, it is the overtly Christian story. Christians read it in their Bible, they hear of it in sermons, maybe they go along to, if they live in a medieval town like York and they have mummers' plays and things like that going on, they can see them played out in the Hollywood biblical epics that they might watch on TV and all that sort of thing. They can engage with their stories in all sorts of different ways. And it comes to shape their lives in quite profound and hopefully positive ways. Whereas Eric Burns, being a therapist, naturally he was interested in what screws people up rather than in what makes them well. The Christian narrative is a positive one for almost everyone. I'm sure for some people less so, but by and large it's a positive story for the people who subscribe to it. And so it uplifts and it changes and it transforms. So you have this narrative of redemption. What is the purpose of life? The purpose of life is to try and help other people be a good Christian, help the people around you, and seek to redeem yourself from your own flaws and weaknesses and problems and inadequacies and wrongdoings and what have you. We could, if I really wanted to bore you into unconsciousness, sit here for hours going over the key narratives in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Islam, in Judaism, and so on. They each have their key narratives, their big central stories, as well as the peripheral edge stories, which help to shape the lives of the people who absorb those stories growing up from the cradle. But coming back to wanting to keep the focus on polytheism, this is where we have a bit of a challenge as 21st century polytheists. First off, you've got all sorts of different people who will use the term polytheist, so some interested in Greek deities, some Roman, some heathen, some Egyptian, some Celtic, some what have you. So it's not as if there is one story that fits everyone who would use the term polytheist. That's the first thing. So we might want to say, well, what's the key story in the Norse sagas? What are the key stories in the Greek stories, in the Greek myths? What are the key stories in the Polynesian cycle of tales? And then start to look at those. The other element we come to, of course, is that very few people grew up with these from the cradle. These days, I mean, obviously you go back into the distant past, yes, people did grow up with them from the cradle. But how many people in 21st century Britain grow up hearing Greek myths or Roman myths or Celtic myths from toddlerhood up to adulthood? Very few people. And so we don't quite have that second nature of story. That's also going to apply to other people who convert to Islam or convert to Christianity or Buddhism or whatever when they're 20, 30, 40, 50. Will be coming to those stories comparatively late in life, and so won't have the cradle experience that other people who are born into families of that religious persuasion have. So there is that element. We are now seeing generations of children with pagan parents. Some pagan parents will raise their kids to be pagan, others will take a very hands-off approach when it comes to religious issues, and so you can't always guarantee how much exposure the child will have to Greek stories, Celtic stories, Chinese stories, whatever it might be that they're growing up with. But let's say at some point you get exposure to those stories. What is often unclear at this juncture, looking back at the distant past, and this is more pronounced for some cultures than it is for others, you got 101 Greek myths. Was there a dominant Greek myth comparable to the story of Christ? So you'd say that there's loads of Christian stories, but it's the story of Christ is the central story. Would people in ancient Greece have said, well, there's all these 101 myths, but this story, this one here, this is the biggie. This is the one that absolutely dominates our psyches, our lives, that shapes our thinking, that shapes our perception of the world. They may have done, but we don't always know that. Now, in some cultures, there appears, and I say appears because there is a room for argument. So, for example, the Egyptians have loads and loads of different stories, but it's the story of the deities that the Greeks referred to as Isis and Osiris and Set. Azet, Azur, and Setech, if you want to use the Egyptian names, or well, depending on how you translate them, possible Egyptian names. The Great Royal Myth, as it was referred to, which is the dominant one. And the reason I'm hovering a little ambiguously there is, was the Great Royal Myth the dominant myth for the rich? Hence, the Great Royal Myth, the tale of the divine pharaoh. Was it also the dominant myth for the people who were tilling the fields and mucking out the camels? Or did ordinary people at the sort of bottom end of society, did they have other stories that they saw as much more relevant to their lives? So what we don't wholly know is whether this was dominant for the entirety of Egyptian society or just a social elite, and other people lower down the social pecking order had other stories they turned to as the big ones. So we could say the same in Rome, in Greece, and so on, where you got, by and large, the stories that made it to writing tend to be stories that were considered very important by the rich, not necessarily stories that were considered very important by the poor. And there is that kind of ambiguity of social class as to how diffused certain stories were through the whole of society. But we have to work with what we've got surviving to us. Other cultures where literacy around religious matters was forbidden, for example, amongst the Celts, we're told that the Druids would not commit their religious teachings to writings. So the myths we have of Ireland and of Wales and other Celtic regions come to us because monks, quite a long time after the pagan religions had gone into decline, they started to write down myths. Quite a lot of those books, they wrote them in, survived. Other books did not, monastery burnings and all the rest of it. So we have some stories. What we don't know, from a Celtic point of view, Druid point of view, is which of those stories would have been considered the big key stories and which would have been considered the more peripheral or edge stories. Nor do we know if that was across the board. So let's stick to mainland Britain for argument's sake. Did every single tribe in the whole of mainland Britain have the same key story? Or would the story that was really important to the Iceni be different to the story that was really important to the Trinovantes, and different again to the story that was really important to the Siluri? We just don't know, because we don't have the level of detail required to work that one out. So we're in the position these days for modern 21st century pagans to do what we're very good at, which is making it up as we go along. In that we have to take the stories that we feel are important to us now, whether or not they were the stories terribly important to people 2,000 odd years ago. And there you could say there is an element of self-selection, self-bias. Partly it's what stories do you know about in the first place to choose from, and partly maybe we are making choices based on individual bias rather than upon deeply rooted cultural patterns from the distant past. But we're kind of, I suppose, creating a new culture in a sense. By recreating elements from old cultures, we are coupling them together in ways that may not reflect the ways they were used in ancient times. And so it's a bit like rearranging a skeleton of a dinosaur. You might not get the bones in the right order. You create something possibly new in that you're putting it into different patterns and maybe filling in the gaps, because half the bones are missing anyway, filling in the gaps with stuff from elsewhere. So what you end up with is probably best described as inspired by earlier cultures rather than a continuance of earlier cultures. So what would, if the tale of Christ's redemption is the key story of Christianity, what tale is the key story of Druidry? And at the moment that can't be answered, because you've got 301 different Druid lodges and clans and groups and whatnot around the world, each with their different take. Half of them can't agree on anything with each other, let alone with anyone outside their organisations. And so there is no central key story that goes across to everyone. But you might take an individual group and say to that individual group, what is your key story? What is the one that dominates your life, shapes your life, gives structure and meaning, and helps to inform ritual in the way that the story of Christ informs Easter and Christmas and so on? What are the stories that shape your year, that shape your comings and goings, where you have a moment in your life and you think to yourself, this is my Chulen moment, or this is my Knunos moment, or this is my Ceridwen moment, or whatever it is that you want to, however you want to contextualize and refer to it. This is the moment in my story, in my life, like that moment in that story. And part of that, of course, is that if you know the story, you know what happens next. So when you start to see those moments in your life, you start to think about or expect certain patterns to be followed in your life, because those are the patterns set, the templates in the stories you're familiar with. And maybe they do. Maybe just your sheer expectation, perhaps, helps to shape what happens next and helps to give meaning. So if you are having that kind of Judas moment, going back to that one, and you feel stabbed in the back by someone you trusted, understanding the Judas story and how Judas fits in with the bigger picture might help you to deal with that sense of betrayal by this trusted friend, relative, whoever it is, that's done you wrong. And likewise, if you're experiencing a death, if you're experiencing a terrible illness or some critical moment in your life, or even a really positive moment in your life, having a context in which to place it helps make those events manageable. Helps maybe to give meaning where otherwise there wouldn't be meaning. And living a life with no meaning is a remarkably difficult thing to do. As Viktor Frankl pointed out many, many times, he survived the concentration camps, got through all of that, moved to America and became a therapist and wrote books and all sorts of things. And he said one of the things that helped him and other people survive the incredible horrors of the concentration camps was to find meaning in life and in events. Find it or create it. People who could see no meaning, for whom it was all just one mindless act of horror after another with no purpose, meaning or anything to it, they were the ones who tended to succumb very quickly and either killed themselves or just effectively gave up the struggle and died. So the need for meaning is what keeps you going through those dark moments, those terrible moments when you are perhaps thinking about slinging yourself off the nearest bridge. To find a meaning is what might keep you going to the next day and help structure events and helps connect events. The meaning attached to births, to deaths, to marriages, to all of these things. All of this is shaped and informed by story. Whereas Baudrillard argues we are shaped and informed by the productions of Hollywood and other big modern day myth makers, if you like, modern day cinematic producers. In the centuries before humanity had such things as Hollywood, we had storytellers around campfires, reciting stories that everyone was very familiar with, like a child who wants to hear the same bedtime story for the 50th night in a row. The job of the storyteller wasn't to come up with brand new clever-ass things and shock everyone with, but to sustain tradition. Because tradition is what gives people meaning, it gives them community. They know the stories, they like the stories, they know when to laugh, they know when to cry, they know when to ooh, they know when to ah. It's that coming together as an audience to listen to the familiar and to understand the patterns formed by the familiar that gives that sense of meaning, a sense of community, a sense of binding together, which often is otherwise might be lacking entirely. And so the positive benefit of the story is that coming together. And I have touched, I think quite a while ago now actually, in a previous podcast, as well as various things I've written for newsletters and whatnot, magazines, that there are some stories which can be seen as quite negative. One of the more well-known examples of this is from Colette Dowling's book, The Cinderella Complex, which is going back to about 1980, 81, round about then. She argued little girls growing up listening to both the Cinderella story itself as a bedtime story, or watching it as a Hollywood film and cartoon, or hearing any one of the umpty hundred imitations of Cinderella, but it's the same basic plot, it's just different character names. Gets recycled and recycled. What does this teach little girls? It teaches them that if their life is dreary and boring and depressing and miserable and they're being put upon by wicked stepmothers and ugly sisters and all the rest of it, then what they need to do is wait. Because eventually, if they wait and they're kind and they're patient and suitably smashing and lovely people, then eventually the handsome prince will turn up and rescue them and make life smashing. So Colette Dowling, being a quite passionate feminist, took this to mean that women were encouraged to passivity. I don't think she gave an awful lot of attention, as I recall, to the ugly sisters and the wicked stepmother bit, and the sort of women being vile to each other part of the story. It was more of a focus on the sweet little girl sitting there like a pudding, waiting for the big brave man to come along and rescue a bit that Colette Dowling objected to. Why be a passive melon if you can take charge of your own life and sort your own problems out? And rather than waiting 20 years for somebody to rescue you, you get off your backside, sort the problems out now, job done. So that was her critique, if you like, of the Cinderella story, was that it encouraged passivity rather than encouraging dynamism and action and energy and vigour and really getting out there and sorting your own problems out. Particularly in girls more so than boys. Boys' stories, the ones with male heroes to them, don't tend to have passive male heroes. They tend to have more active male heroes who go out and do stuff rather than just sitting around like puddings. So that is a potential problem, not specifically just focusing on the Cinderella example. You could probably think of other stories that are told, just as we're saying about the life scripts earlier with Eric Byrne, and family stories handed down between generations of families that pass on the miseries and griefs of previous generations to be sustained by the next and the next and the next. We may have stories which are either familial stories or indeed are fairy tales, religious stories, political, ideological stories, passed from generation to generation, which we might say to ourselves, well, they're just stories, that's all they are. But the point of people like Dowling and Byrne and 101 others is that they're never just stories. There's no such thing as just a story. Stories are hugely powerful things. They shape the world. They shape our lives. Some stories may go in one ear and out the other and have very little impact on you, but there are other stories which, perhaps because you just hear them so often, repeatedly, come to form patterns, imprints, like a dinosaur's footprint in mud that's still there a million years later, that form an imprint on our psyches and really shape our lives, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. But part of the key for both Dowling and Byrne and many others is to become conscious of the stories that shape your life, because when you are conscious of them, you can think about whether these are good stories or bad stories, helpful or unhelpful. Whilst you're just kind of blundering on half asleep, you pay very little attention, and the story does its thing, whether you want it to or not. And so it's better to have a story that does its thing because you want it to, because you recognise it as a good story, than to be semi-conscious and blundering through life in this half-awake state, or half-asleep state, as the case may be, and effectively a victim of your own storytelling. I say your own storytelling. An entire culture of storytellers that shape and form the mind. So to give you a couple of other examples just before I run out of breath, you could say Beauty and the Beast. Yeah, we're all familiar with that as a children's story, but it's also repeated in 1001 other forms of the, well, usually a young woman falls in love with something hideous, whether it's a beast or a toad or whatever, and through patience and kindness and so forth, eventually the ugly frog or toad turns into a handsome prince, or the beast turns into a handsome prince. There are some variations in some cultures where it's a man falling in love with a hideous thing that a creature, female creature, that turns out to be the beautiful princess. For example, the Arthurian stories, there's a tale of a knight who has to kiss the loathly lady, this hideous old kind of demonic-looking crone, who then turns into a beautiful woman. So you do get gender spins and variations on this, but usually the beast is male, and the patient lead character is female. Is the underpinning of this story that should you meet anyone who's god-awful and terrible and monstrous, you've got to be patient and kind and put up with them and put up with them and put up with them no matter what, and eventually they'll become a lovely person. That could, of course, be the basis of a lot of abusive relationships with someone who is beastly in their behaviour and who has some codependent partner who is always coping with their bad tempers and their rages and their screaming and shouting and their adulteries and drug addictions and alcoholisms and whatever else. in the hope that one day their kindness and love and patience will pay off, and this total arse will turn into a handsome prince, or beautiful princess, as the case may be. But equally, could we not say that is the basis of psychotherapy? You take someone who's a complete mess, and through patience and kindness and persistence, eventually, at the end of the therapy sessions, you've turned them, if not into a handsome prince or a beautiful princess, at least a functional human being. Is that not the basis of a lot of religious teachings? You take people when they're a mess, and kindness and patience pays off. You know, what's the alternative? They're a monster and they stay a monster forever, and no one has to be kind to them or patient to them or caring towards them. They just get damned forevermore. Now, clearly there are cases where some people are quite horrible, but it's the kindness of those around them that melts their monstrous outer shell, and they do come good. There are cases where that happens, quite a few cases where that happens. Other people, of course, go to their graves being just as bloody horrible as they were at the start. As a story, is Beauty and the Beast a good story? Because it's about patience and kindness to those who are wounded and damaged and trying to help them? Or is it a bad story because it's conditioning passivity in women or men, as the case may be, to put up with abusive partners who are just going to treat them like dirt forevermore? Could go either way. But being conscious of the story, and if this is the story you choose to live by, are you applying it wisely to every area of your life? Whether that area is your romantic relationships, or you're in a kind of a career where you're helping the wounded and the damaged and trying to cope with their excesses and you know, mopping up the mess after them, or maybe it's in some other context, family context or whatever, that you're trying to turn the beast into something wonderful. There's numerous other stories we could think about, you know, Robin Hood in the forest, things like that, that justify a lot of behaviours, a lot of actions, especially at the moment. I think a lot of maybe protest movements fancy themselves as Robin Hood standing up against the wicked sheriff. Are they always quite as good as they think they are? Very few people have a story in which they're the monster. And it's everyone else, it's somebody else that's lovely, they're the horrible one. We are invariably the hero in our own story. We're very rarely the villain in our own story. Therein is a debate in itself, but I think that's probably enough waffle for now. But to think on, I suppose what I'm getting at here is for polytheists particularly, to invest thought in the stories they have, their religious stories, their both the big major mythical stories, but also the kind of smaller peripheral stories. How did our coven form? How did our druid group get together? Who are we? What do we do? All those sorts of smaller stories that proliferate around the edge. But primarily to think in terms of those big mythical stories. What do they mean about human life? What do they mean about our life? Do they shape our lives for good or shape our lives for ill? Do they shape our year, our festivals, our celebrations, give meaning to events? Both annual events that happen on a cyclical basis, but also events like weddings and baby namings and funerals. How are they informed by our stories and our understandings of who we are and where we've come from? Do our stories have villains? Going back to that bit about so many sort of political movements, religious movements, the rest of it, having a baddie. There's us and then there's the baddie, and we've got to struggle against the baddie. So if you are a polytheist, is there a baddie in your stories? If so, who is that in daily life? How does that pan out to a malevolent force that has to be resisted, fought against, battled against? Equally, who are the benevolent forces that are to be allied with and worked alongside? So how do we kind of contextualise these big stories in our lives and understand how they impact us, shape us, form us, change us? And particularly, I suppose, within polytheism, because just about all the forms of polytheism I can think of off the top of my head, we don't just have one story, we have dozens upon dozens upon dozens of stories, great big bodies of myth. So there is a kind of maybe an element of choosing between several and thinking, well, is this the story we should be going for, or what about that one, or what about this one, or what about that one? And having a degree of choice to exercise over which stories become the templates of your life. I think I'll leave that there for now. Be interesting to hear which stories you have as the templates of your life, and whether you feel they're good, bad, indifferent, a bit of a parson's egg, perhaps. Oh yes, might be good to hear from you.